So a macro dose would be something like, 2, 3, 3.5 grams. And then a micro dose is just a fraction of that. That's like 1/10 of a gram, maybe up to like 0.4, 0.5 of a gram, depending on how deep you want to go. When you microdose, you're not having those traditional psychedelic effects that we tend to see in movies where like things get all geometric shapes and things are moving and stuff like that. Like you're not going to have that necessarily.
Welcome to the Mindfulness Experience podcast. I'm your host, Keith Fiveson, and we're an official podcast for the Wonderland Miami 2023 conference from November 9th through the 11th. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Jennifer Chesak, an award-winning freelance science and journalist, editor, and fact-checker based in Nashville, Tennessee. And she's joining us to discuss her latest work on microdosing magical mushrooms and the benefits of psychedelics in medicine. It's an honor to have Jennifer with us today, especially since she will be speaking at Wonderland at the conference. And we're going to find out all about that. Hey. Jennifer, hello. How are you?
I'm great. How are you? Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're so welcome. And I'm so excited to have you here because you're going to speak about a topic that I'm going to learn about. And, kind of because your latest book, you've got this book and it's really focused on women. It's the Psilocybin Handbook for Women. And I'm not a woman, at least, maybe I don't know. Maybe I am a woman in some ways, I can embrace that feminine aspects of myself, but your book is really focused on women and their specific psychology and neurology and biology, and all of that good stuff. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how that book kind of is centered for the women that are listening and for the men who may need to know?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the book is the Psilocybin Handbook for Women, and it dives into the intersection of women's health with magic mushrooms, with psilocybin, of course. And so it explores all these aspects, such as like how does psilocybin affect the menstrual cycle? Would psilocybin be useful for menopause symptoms? Things like that. And it explores the connection between or how applications for psilocybin in parenting and whether or not you can use psilocybin while pregnant or breastfeeding, all of these aspects that really intersect with women's health. And the reason that the book really focuses on women is because there actually are, in many cases, more women are using some psychedelics more frequently than men are, which at first when I did the research was a surprise, as it might surprise you too, right?
Yeah. I heard about this trend of microdosing moms. So, but you're telling me something I didn't realize and I didn't know. What's that about?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question, because when I dug a little, at first I was surprised, but then when I dug a little deeper, it made more sense that more women are using psychedelics. And it's simply because, and another fact is that when men use psychedelics, they typically are using in a more recreational fashion. Nothing wrong with that. And that's not the case for every man, of course. But what women are using psychedelics for is to self-treat medical or mental health conditions or chronic health conditions. And that did not come as a surprise to me, because simply that the mainstream medical community has often left women's health as like the last thing that's studied. Women weren't even included in early stage clinical trials until about the 1990s. And so that has had lasting ramifications on women's health. So just to kind of put that into context, I always like to back up my information with facts. So men had a drug for male sexual dysfunction in 1998, and everyone is familiar with what that drug is. It's Viagra. At that point in time, with women's health, we didn't even have a complete picture of what the clitoris is. There's all this internal structure to the clitoris. That didn't happen until 2005, when a female urologist did the research. I know, 2005, we finally figure out where the clitoris is, right? And fast forward, women didn't get a drug for female sexual dysfunction until 2015. 17-year gap between when men got a drug for something to the same condition that women got a drug 17 years later. So yeah, it's really important that we actually treat the female body and the male body differently in science. And so that it's the same case for something like psilocybin. And as I mentioned, women are using psychedelics in many cases to self-treat, and they are all also disproportionately affected by many conditions such as PTSD, other forms of trauma, depression, the list goes on and on. Yet the medical community tends to take the health of women much less seriously. Women are more disproportionately affected by medical gaslighting, where they're told that things are all in their head, all of that. And I've got direct firsthand experience with that. But I'll let you talk for a minute.
No. I'm so excited with this topic and what your book is about. And I'm really not, we sort of talked about the little things. Well, they're not little. I mean, first of all, I had no idea about the research elements. I thought the NRA, the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, was passed in the 70s. I didn't realize that it wasn't passed. All right. And then you start to take a look at, being involved in clinical trials, not until the 90s. There's been this boom in the mental health space, and psychedelics certainly have taken center stage. You started talking about women's issues, and I'm wondering, in terms of the medical benefits, or starting to look at the psychological benefits, why is it that, when we look at, PTSD or gaslighting or any of these other issues, what happens when they look at psilocybin? Is it different than if a man is taking psilocybin? And within the context of that, I'm just trying to understand, how do they come out differently? Or what's the same? Because every trip for every individual is different, but, and every issue we'd like to think is different, but please.
Yeah, so obviously our lived experiences can certainly inform a psychedelic journey, whether it's psilocybin or another one. But physically, estrogen affects the binding of the serotonin receptor site. So there's possibly some interaction there that could be some type of entourage effect, where either estrogen creates a beneficial effect or a negative effect. We don't really know yet. We're still, researchers are still studying that. But we do know that psilocybin likely impacts the menstrual cycle. So there have been a lot of case studies and anecdotal reports that have come out where women are experiencing where their periods come a little early after doing a psilocybin journey, or it's possible that in some cases their periods have returned after they've been absent for a while, or they return to menstrual regularity after a time of irregularity where their cycle's all wonky. And so that's really important for women's health, because we do have conditions like premenstrual dysphoric disorder that can dysregulate the menstrual cycle. So now there's no guarantee that just by using psilocybin that it would re-regulate your cycle, but we are starting to see some research coming out about that. And if people are curious about the mechanisms of action, it's that the menstrual cycle occurs along what's called the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, meaning that when one hormone kicks off, say estrogen, it tells another hormone what to do along that axis. And that's how the cycle sort of happens, the trajectory of the cycle. Then we also have the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and that controls our stress response. And so when we use psilocybin, we are activating that axis. And again, that's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And you can tell that these two axes overlap with the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So one axis can affect the other. We already know that if we're stressed, our cycles might become irregular, or if we get our cycle, if we're on our period, we can become more stressed, of course. So we know already that these axes overlap, but there is preliminary research to suggest that psilocybin does also impact the menstrual cycle. Typically, it seems like with having beneficial effects, so that it may matter when a woman, where a person is on her cycle. It may matter when we use psilocybin, like whether for a deeper journey or how we microdose. And so I did talk to an indigenous wisdom expert for the book, and she recommended that if a person is planning to do a journey, that they try to do that closer to ovulation rather than as you get closer to your period. And that has to do with the types of energy in our body. And I don't mean energy like, feeling energetic. I mean, like sort of glucose metabolism and things like that. That's all being, as we get closer to our cycle, our periods, we become a little bit more insulin resistant in our bodies. And so a journey can take a lot out of you. And so it's harder to journey when you're closer to your period than when you are at ovulation. So that's kind of in a nutshell some of the stuff that I cover about the menstrual cycle, but I'll dive deeper later.
So it's kind of like, here we are, we just had a new moon, and, we're just at the beginning of a new period of realization or actualization. And I'm trying to bring this into me as a male, as a veteran who, has worked with folks that have PTSD and so on, but our conversation is much more in a creative flow, like literally, physically, mentally, biologically, the physiology of it just makes a lot of sense. And I'm just trying to figure out if from a male viewpoint, if we've got the same kind of capability, because, when we start taking a look at, seasonality, and we start taking a look at everyone has a cyclic rhythm, right? Everyone has a biorhythm. And what you have any thoughts about that? Would I be well served by reading your book to go ahead and get some insider tips in terms of when, from a mindful viewpoint, when I might, whether or not I'm advising or using?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously a lot of the chapters do focus very specifically on women's health, but I have other chapters intermingled throughout the book. So for example, chapter 3 is all about the neurobiology of what happens in your brain when you and in your body when you use psilocybin. And so I think that is something that's really beneficial to everyone to read that. And then I also have a logistics chapter, so diving into aspects of set and setting, set being your mindset when you go into a journey, and then setting being your environment, who's around you, all of that. And those types of things set and setting are really important when you are about to do a journey, because if you are in the wrong mindset, you can certainly have a negative experience in a journey. And then same thing, if your environment is not conducive to keeping you calm and relaxed, you could also end up having a difficult journey. So that's why I incorporated those chapters, and they really benefit anyone. And I think also I do have a lot of men reaching out to me saying, I got your book and I'm reading it and it's great information, even despite that I focus on women's health specifically. But also a lot of men are buying the book to give to their partners, perhaps, or parents, or a female friend who may be interested in psilocybin. And I think that's beautiful, because I think one of the issues with the psychedelic space is that it can have a bit of a bro feel to it. And so sometimes women feel excluded, and certainly they're excluded in conferences and things like that when in talking about the science. And so I love that men are choosing to buy the book instead of mansplaining to their female counterparts that want to dive into psilocybin if they already have knowledge about psilocybin.
Right. Well, I looked at getting the book myself. I and our time together, really, we had made our setup, and it was so short. I was trying to glean what I could from the book, from your website. And, it really is wonderful that you're really providing this sort of 101, if not more deeper dive into not only what it does from the neurochemistry or the biology or the physiology, but you're also helping them to set up, what the intentions are, what the mindset is, what the setting is in terms of safety, and also ways of integrating, because many men really, I work with men all the time. That's really where my sweet spot is, if you will, working with men. And the emotional literacy of men is, not as great as it is with women. Women have a greater emotional literacy. They're able to go ahead and somehow connect the left and the right hemispheres and really be able to go ahead and introspect and figure out what's going on. Now, I want to talk about microdosing, because to the layman, how would you describe the concept of microdosing psychedelics? And, are there any proven practices? And, is it safe for everyone to try? I'm just wondering, I wrote something on microdosing on the microdose platform on psychedelics and the future of mental health care. And I'm wondering from your viewpoint, is this sort of the, I wouldn't say it's the panacea, but I do see more and more people going that route, but I don't see the efficacy rates or the science that really kind of backs it up. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that and also speak to, what your view is in terms of the safety and the practice.
Sure, absolutely. So just to give readers, listeners a background.
Right.
So a macro dose would be something like, 2, 3, 3.5 grams. And then a micro dose is just a fraction of that. That's like 1/10 of a gram, maybe up to like 0.4, 0.5 of a gram, depending on how deep you want to go. But when you microdose, you're not having those traditional psychedelic effects that we tend to see in movies where like things get all geometric shapes and things are moving and stuff like
Patterns.
that, patterns, stuff like that. You're not going to have that necessarily. You won't really notice that you took it in terms of like visuals, but you may feel differently in your body, such as like having just, taking the edge off the day, feeling less anxiety, feeling more focused perhaps. But you are correct in what you say, and that we don't yet have the efficacy in the science to show that is what is happening when we microdose. We don't know that from a scientific perspective, but of course, microdosing has been around for a long time and many people swear by it. And I think a couple of things to consider here are that we do have research on macro doses in clinical trials, and obviously we have so much indigenous wisdom to pull from, and it's really important to pull from that. And with a macro dose, what we're learning with depression is that it's lasting. The effects are lasting. So you may not even need to microdose. You could do a deeper journey and then have your experience and integrate it properly. Integration, for anyone who doesn't know, is the process of learning from your experience, whether you're integrating with a psychedelic assisted therapist, or you might have an integration community that you work with, or you can just journal and learn from your experience. But that is what causes those lasting changes. That integration process is really important to that. But again, we're seeing in clinical trials that it's a lasting effect in terms of relieving depression, relieving certain trauma aspects of trauma, all of that. So you may not need to microdose. However, it's certainly an option, and people are trying it and having generally good experiences. And one thing to consider is that, a lot of people who have depression or other mental health conditions are immediately put on like an SSRI, which is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. You have to take those regularly as a medication. They're great medications. I appreciate that they're out there, and I certainly wouldn't want anyone to go off of their medication if it's working for them. But with SSRIs, you are blunting your mood. So you're blunting not only your lows, but also your highs. And there is research out there to show that psilocybin, instead of blunting your mood, actually makes you feel more okay with not only your lows, but also your highs. Like you just feel better on trying psilocybin, and that's an effect that happens from a deeper journey in terms of the research right now. But with microdosing protocols, there are several different protocols out there that people have been practicing for a long time. One of them is the Fadiman protocol. The other is the Stamets stack. There are several. I do list those specific ones in my book in terms of how you microdose. There's usually a practice of doing a few days on, a few days off for a while, and then you take a break and that sort of thing. And that's how that works. But it might be more effective for someone than being on an SSRI.
And when we start talking about stacking, I think that's important to talk about in terms of whether or not it's 100 milligrams or whatever, but it's the stacking process. Can you just speak to that for a
Yeah,
moment?
I don't have the amounts in front of
But
me,
it's
but
like
with the
with lion's mane and
yes,
yeah.
that's the Stammet stack. It uses lion's mane, which is more of a functional
Mhm.
medicinal mushroom.
Right.
It's not a psychedelic mushroom.
Mhm.
And then it also uses niacin, which is
Mhm.
essentially vitamin B3.
Right.
The caveat with niacin is that it
Mhm.
can cause some flushing if you get too
Mhm.
much of it in your system.
Mhm.
So you may be consuming a lot of vitamin B3 through your diet. And so, you may want to be watchful or mindful about your actual full vitamin
Mhm.
B3
Right.
intake. So to avoid that sort of painful flushing that can occur from that.
Mhm.
So yeah, but
And
that's the
but
stack.
it's but other than the niacin, it's mushrooms. So
Well,
this
yes,
is it's like 100% mushrooms. You have a little niacin in there, but that helps to go ahead and move it through the circulation through the body, right? That's a
right.
circulatory aspect in terms of working with the blood. Yeah.
And niacin is so important for just our cells, our
Mhm.
cellular health. And
Mhm.
that's simply because I don't want to get too sciencey here, but
Well, I love science. Do it.
vitamin B3 converts to something called NAD plus in our bodies, and that is crucial for how our body uses glucose and sort of just all these facets of energy in our
Mhm.
cells.
Mhm.
And as we age, so by the time you're in middle age, I'm in middle age, I'm
Mhm.
44, your niacin, or I'm sorry, your NAD plus
Mhm.
levels have decreased by
Mhm.
almost half, I believe.
Yep.
And so that's why we end up having all of these aging
Mhm.
processes. So niacin it comes in multiple
Mhm.
forms. Being researched right now in longevity, which is obviously another huge
Mhm.
topic at the Wonderland
Right.
conference, and I'm so fascinated by it. So I
Yeah.
think you may have some long benefits for longevity
Oh, that's
with
another
that Stammet
conversation, the
stack.
longevity
Yeah,
conversation.
totally.
I just got some supplements, so I'm not, I'm trying to reverse. I'm a little old, but I'm trying to reverse I'm not that old, but I'm whatever. So the point being is I do take B3 though,
Yeah,
so that's good for you. And
it's good
and
for you.
and let me ask you, in your, as we start taking a look at psychedelics and, as a treatment process, do you see them as an alternative treatment, maybe perhaps? And we start seeing, like right now in Kansas, I was talking about this earlier. In Kansas, they've just, put $42 million into a harm reduction program studying ibogaine, right? And really
Hmm.
using that in terms of looking at opioid addiction. And I'm wondering, in your viewpoint, whether or not, from a addiction, depression, and anxiety viewpoint, are these are issues traditional medicine has struggled with. So, do you see the efficacy rates sort of moving the needle forward, and where do you think that'll go? And let me just add on to you, because it's the mindfulness experience. What are the things that we need to be mindful of in order to help move that needle forward and not have it ricochet back?
Yeah. So I think with addiction or any type of substance use issue, we are seeing good things come out in clinical trials, which I'm really excited about because currently, when we think about addiction, we really just don't have effective
Mhm.
treatments for that. There's the AA model, which works really well for some people and is not of interest for
Mhm.
others, or it's very difficult to do. And so we need to be thinking of different. We need to be thinking outside the box in terms
Right.
of helping people with addiction. And there are clinical trials coming out, and I do
Mhm.
think that needle will be moved really well with psilocybin. At least that is my hope. Just in terms of alcohol use disorder, there was a great study that came out where
Mhm.
after people did a psilocybin journey in a
Mhm. Mhm.
with a psychedelic assisted therapist, sort of in a therapeutic setting, they reduced their heavy drinking days by I forget how much, but it was
Mhm.
really interesting. And in addiction, we typically treat people in terms of like, oh, you have to stop everything. You cannot have a drink. If you're in recovery, you're sober.
Mhm.
And that doesn't work for many people. We need to meet people where they are in their
Mhm.
addiction processes. And that's essentially a form of harm reduction.
Right.
And then in terms of being mindful as we move forward, I think just trying to encourage people to stop thinking about the war on drugs and realized that there was so much misinformation that came out during that time period. So there can be this idea like, oh, well, you can't treat addiction with a drug, like you can't treat addiction with another like illicit substance, because it's still illegal federally, psilocybin is, and we need to stop thinking that way, because we are clearly proving over time the efficacy of all psychedelics. I mean, there are, especially MDMA and psilocybin are really gaining some traction. And so we really need to be looking at that and thinking about that. And one of the things that, I was asked recently in an interview that sort of surprised me was someone said, there are a lot of therapists out there, mental health professionals, that are worried that people are just going to skip all the other options for like treating depression or treating anxiety and go straight to psilocybin. And my question for those people is, why would you think that's a problem? I mean, are you so worried about like taking money away from the pharmaceutical industry? Because obviously pharmaceuticals are, expensive.
Yeah, and you can get a grow kit for $100 and grow your own. So
right, exactly. So I don't see the problem with people going directly to psilocybin, as long as they're doing it in a safe way and being mindful about it. And again, nothing wrong with using psilocybin recreationally, but if you are using it to treat a mental health condition, you want to do that in a very mindful and therapeutic way.
Right. Well, and the analogy that pops up for me is that, today is Rosh Hashanah, right? And, it's the new year. And, whether or not you're Judeo-Christian, Buddhist, Taoist, Hindu, Islamic, doesn't matter. There is a quality of sacredness. And, we're talking about the science and the sacred. So, would you take the science, specifically, would you take the science into a church and stream and not prepare or not have reverence? So there's this quality of reverence, I think, that we're all trying to bring into it, to really have a quality of setting,
Yes.
And really understand that this is the opportunity to literally put at the altar your ego, and to really look at a reboot, a reset, and a reframe. And isn't that what we all want, to sort of aspire to transcendence or aspire to some sort of, change?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that we need to be merging the, scientific research that's coming out now, and then also all of this indigenous wisdom that we have a track record of. We think of science as the process of doing something over and over again to reproduce the same results, but that's exactly what indigenous peoples have done with psilocybin for however long, far back, centuries, I guess, and so it's really important to be bringing that in. And when I was doing the interviews for my book, I interviewed a psychologist or a therapist, I can't remember, but her name is Natalie Villanova, and she talked about this two-eyed seeing concept that was first brought to mainstream science by a Mi'kmaq elder named Albert Marshall, I believe. I'm sorry, I really wanted to get that correct. Albert Marshall. And he was in the Ecosone First Nation. And so he brought this idea together of like, we need to be merging science and indigenous wisdom for all facets of our lives, because it's so important. And you hit on a really great point there in terms of set and setting. So if we bring ceremony to our psilocybin practice, and thinking about indigenous cultures and how they use ceremony, it does help you put you in a better mindset going into your journey, and helps relax you, helps keep you calm, rather than if you're just like at a festival eating mushrooms, right? Where you could have a very negative experience. Not everyone does, but
Right. And it's not, and within that openness, because there is this grand, ineffable openness, it's also important to go ahead and have boundaries, to really recognize your boundaries. And I think that's one of the things that I think is most perplexing in terms of how do we make this available to the people that need it, and not debase it in a way that it becomes like an addiction, like what we saw. I don't know. I keep talking about this Netflix special, the Painkiller, about
So,
the whole idea of the Purdue Pharma and the
mhm.
rise of opioids and having heroin in a pill. That's what people are afraid of. They're afraid with all of the stuff that we're somehow going to create a nation of zombies, where it's exactly the opposite, where you have people who are opening up their consciousness through neurogenesis and being able to deal with epigenetic trauma and being able to deal with all these other things. So there is this opportunity, and I'm just wondering, how do we get beyond the stigma?
Yeah, it's hard because, I'm facing it as I'm promoting, I'm in the throes of promoting my book, and I'm certainly facing that stigma in certain places where, like, a television reporter will reach out to me, want to interview me, and then the news director will say, no, we can't interview you about those illegal drugs. And so I always try to bring up the war on drugs and discuss
Mhm,
how there was so much disinformation out there.
mhm,
I think it's also important to talk about the iron law of prohibition. Just because you have something illegal doesn't mean people aren't going. I mean, that doesn't mean that people will stop doing it, right?
mhm,
I mean, if you think about and when we make things illegal, then worse things are created. So fentanyl is a great example. Heroin's illegal. Fentanyl is easier to transport and add to whatever, and so that's out there, and that's causing
mhm,
the overdoses.
mhm,
And just because that psilocybin is illegal doesn't mean that people aren't using it. And I also think it helps to explain, in terms of stigma, I think it helps to explain, well, how does psilocybin even work? Because we see all these things in movies and it just looks like someone's having like a wonky trip and,
mhm.
going out of their mind. That's not really the actual representation, the proper representation of what happens during a psilocybin journey.
Right.
So I always like to explain how psilocybin actually works. And researchers have come up with a really great model to
Mhm,
explain that.
mhm.
This is
Oh, good.
Dr. Robin Carhart
Yep.
Harris, and Dr. Carl J. Friston. They came up with this model. It's called the Rebus model, and it stands for Relaxed Beliefs Under Psychedelics.
Mm,
And I think this is such a great model to explain it, and they've got a great analogy too. So, when we're children, our brains are super flexible. We haven't formulated our beliefs about ourselves or how the world around us operates. But as we get into adulthood, our brains become much more rigid because we have formulated our identity and how the world around us operates. And so there is also research out there that shows that rigidity is more prevalent in people who have depression, anxiety, trauma, and things like that.
mhm,
Well, when you take a psychedelic, it's essentially that you become more flexible again. Your
mhm,
brain becomes more entropic. And so to think about this in the analogy that they created, which I just love, is that when we're in normal states of consciousness, like I am right now, your brain is very rigid. If you were to try to take a new idea or belief about yourself, let's
mhm,
say you're trying to convince yourself that you're acceptable in social
mhm,
situations, maybe you have social anxiety, you try to get that belief in your brain, your brain is like a frozen
mhm.
pond, and you think about it, the belief as a rock, you drop it on that frozen pond, it doesn't gain entry. We just have a lot of trouble changing our minds in
Right.
normal states of consciousness. When we're on a psychedelic, however, that brain now becomes a thawed pond, and
Mhm,
now we can take that rock in the form of a new belief, drop it in, it gains entry, it causes a ripple effect, it's a lasting
mm,
thing.
mhm,
So that is a really great way to explain, why would a psychedelic even work to help
mhm.
people have these beneficial and therapeutic effects.
Right. So we basically are shutting down our default mode network and allowing this neurogenesis, this neuroplasticity, the ability of the brain to go ahead and interconnect with regions that it normally doesn't deal with, right? And then
Yeah.
we're able to go ahead and have these sensory experiences where suddenly we're able to hear and see sound, or you know,
Right.
we're able to see color and hues in the air that we normally might not see, things that are really more open to us. And you just explained it wonderfully. And that was rebus, rebus.
REBUS.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And I love that you brought up the default mode
Mhm,
network. The
mhm,
default mode network is a network of brain regions that work together, and they really formulate our sense of self, our memories, our
mhm,
sense of our fear, our triggers, things like that are all involved in this default mode network. And so when we are on a psychedelic, you said it pretty well. It's that it's like some areas of the brain that normally disconnect, while other areas that don't normally connect. So it's like we've taken, we've got like some massive outlet on the wall with a bunch of different plugs, and we've pulled them out and rearranged them, right? And so it allows this entropic state of mind where we can get new information in that we just cannot do in a normal state of consciousness.
I love that. It's sort of, I just had this vision of sort of, taking the paint off of a painting and then just rearranging the colors and rearranging, it's really having an opportunity to reboot, reset, reframe, and
absolutely. And you go back to the normal way that things are plugged in after after your journey, but you still have the beneficial effects of that switch up, and that increased neuroplasticity.
Yeah, it's everyone talks about the journey, and it's a journey, and you kind of wonder, well, what does that mean? But I've always found that when you go on a journey, when you actually go somewhere, you never come back the same. It changes you. So you come back home, but inside your whole view of the world has changed, and I think that's one of the reasons why we call this work kind of journey work, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I like what you just said, that we never come back the same. And, and that's true. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the mushroom is going to teach you what your brain needs to know the most right now, but it's only working on information that's already in your brain. And that's hard to wrap your head around. But essentially, the mushroom teaches you or enlightens you to the tools that you have within yourself to cope with depression, to cope with anxiety, to cope with, PTSD. It just gives you the tools. It teaches you about the tools that you didn't know you had, but they're there.
Beautiful, beautiful. So let me ask you, your work is mostly focused on chronic health issues, medical rights, healthcare, harm reduction, and scientific evidence around health and wellness trends. And that includes cannabis and psychedelics, and I'd like to unpack a little bit of that, but I also want to ask you, what other projects are in the works that you can possibly share? I mean, you're doing a lot there, and what can we look forward to over in Wonderland at the conference? What's that going to be about?
Yeah, so I'll have my book there. And then in terms of speaking, I will be talking about that intersection of psilocybin and women's health, and really kind of bringing to light this idea that women's health is not taken seriously, and it really needs to be. And what I love about the psychedelic space right now is that we have some really innovative researchers in this space who are digging into women's health and the relation to psilocybin. So the information that I was talking about regarding the menstrual cycle, a lot of that comes from a Johns Hopkins study where some wonderful female researchers are doing the work. And so I am so excited about that.
Yeah. That's great. So as we start to, I'm particularly interested at the moment, because I got into a very heated conversation yesterday around the use of cannabis, and specifically, how cannabis has been recreationalized, and people were concerned because it's all over the place and people aren't using it right. And what are they doing? And, is the same thing going to happen with psychedelics? And, are people just going to, is everyone just going to check out? And, especially here in New York, because in New York City, you walk around and it's absolutely everywhere. And of course, it's there because you can't smoke inside. That's not allowed. It's not allowed by law. So I'm just wondering your thoughts about that, specifically because we're going to be at this Wonderland conference. There's going to be probably about 3,000, maybe more, 4,000 people, who knows at this particular point. But, it is, and we were just at the Psychedelic Science 2023 convention, 13,000 people. Burning Man, people just came at 75,000 people. So I'm just wondering, there seems to be a growth in this. Is there a potential in your mind that the cat will get out of the bag, or the horse will get out of the gate without a saddle? Give me
I'm
your
not worried
perspective.
about that. I
No?
think, I want people to have access
Mhm.
to medications that help them, including
Right.
psilocybin, including cannabis.
Mhm.
I think what we need to remember, again, going back to this iron law of prohibition, when
Mhm.
we outlaw something, we are only creating a worse problem. So if we think,
Mhm.
even going back to the days of booze
Mhm.
prohibition, what happened? People made moonshine back in the
Mhm.
hills, and it was extremely high, alcohol
Mhm.
content, and harms people.
Mhm.
And so, we just always have these issues. And the same thing happens in the cannabis space.
Mhm.
So just because I mean, obviously it's legal in certain areas, but I live in a state where, yes, we have hemp. You can use hemp derived
Mhm.
THC, but by the time you extract THC from hemp, it's practically synthetic. And so you have these products like Delta 8, right?
Mhm.
That is what's causing people to end up in the ER. It's not
Mhm.
regular cannabis, it's not
Mhm.
regular Delta 9
Mhm.
THC. There are studies about this. It's showing states that don't have legal Delta 9 THC
Mhm.
have more emergency room visits for
Mhm.
synthetic cannabis than
Right.
other places, and specifically with children. So
Mhm.
let's stop making drugs illegal. Let's
Mhm.
legalize these things, and let's give people proper access where we have,
Mhm.
sources that can be trusted. Now I can go to my cannabis dispensary, not in my state because
Mhm.
it's illegal, but I can go up to Illinois and I
Mhm.
can get my cannabis,
Mhm.
and I can check the certificate of analysis and see exactly what's in
Right.
the product, how much THC, how much
Mhm.
CBD, all of that.
How
What if
much
we,
lead or cadmium is
yeah,
in there? I
how
just
much
read that was
pesticide?
part of the argument, by the way, because they were talking about
Sure.
the lead and the cadmium, but then when you unpack the research and you went back, they had no controls. You didn't know whether or not they were smoking it or ingesting it or
Right.
whatever, and they also didn't tell you about how much they were doing or whether or not it was from a farm, a dispensary, or whether or not it was off the street.
Right. Was it from, a place that has a really good certificate analysis? There's just no information
Right.
on that. Plus, what else are people consuming or doing that
Mhm.
affects where do they live? Their environment could,
Mhm.
by nature, create more lead in their bodies. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, a ridiculous information
Mhm.
that came out. But I
Mhm.
ultimately, when you have the pure product out there, again, Delta 9 THC, you're
Mhm.
not having problems. It's one of the least toxic drugs out there. And same with psilocybin is very much on par with
Mhm.
that, as long as you're getting psilocybin and not, some random mushroom
Right.
that's poisonous,
Good,
but
good.
if we have access,
Yeah.
we have proper
Yeah.
access to the right
So
thing.
legalization definitely allows some, not only fostering some controls, but it also provides a mechanism so that we know that we're getting safe, product, and that the individuals are able to go ahead and use it in an environment where they don't have to be freaked out about somebody coming to go ahead and get them.
Right,
Yet
exactly.
I was talking with someone yesterday also that was talking about Ready Whip, the laughing gas, and they were saying in the UK they've now made that illegal. Laughing gas is illegal, so you can't even have a Ready Whip to go ahead. I mean, that's I couldn't do anything but laugh. Um, but it is serious, and you do have to have some guidelines for it. Let me ask you, as we start to round up here, in your opinion, and this is again the mindfulness experience. So I'm wondering, from the steps that people can take to integrate mindfulness and psychedelics into their daily lives, because I'm a firm believer that the medicine is inside of us. The medicine is inside of us, and it's only going to show us a window or a doorway that we need to walk through, or something that we need to be taking a look at to go ahead and finally give a hug to, rather than try to exile in some way that just keeps on coming back to us. So mindfulness or breath work to me are very big in this space. I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of being able to integrate these, and what are some of the practical steps that people can look at?
Yeah, I think a very like simple practical step is just immediately after your journey or as you're kind of coming down from your journey,
Mhm.
to grab a journal and just jot down, doesn't have to be good writing, just jot down what insights came up, just
Mhm.
because though, you don't want to forget what those were, and they're really prevalent right as you're coming down or right after your journey. And so get it on paper. And then, later, if you're someone like me who is I love to write. And so it was
Mhm.
very easy for me to like take my journal then and then write more in depth about my experience. But again, there are all of these circles out there of people, like-minded people who have integration like communities. There are, integration communities for, Black, Indigenous people of color. There, so specifically people who have some of your lived
Mhm.
experiences. There
Mhm.
are women integration circles. There are mom integration circles,
Mm.
parents in general. All of that can really be beneficial. And then, of course, there are psychedelic integration therapists out there where you're not necessarily going to see them to do your journey, although
Mhm.
there are some that do both. But then there are also integration therapists who help you navigate, well, what insights came up, and then learning from those insights, and kind of incorporating behavior changes if that's something, if that's a goal.
Right.
But yeah, that mindfulness is really important, that integration is really important, and like you said, it's like the medicine actually lives inside you, because once you have that experience, you've had it. No one can take that experience away from you, and you will continue to learn from it. I had a journey a year ago,
Mhm.
in August, that I'm still learning from. Like, I'm
Mhm.
still integrating it. So
Mhm.
that's why I think it's such a beautiful thing in terms of helping people with depression, because it can be that you do it once. It might be that you do it once a year, that sort of thing, as opposed to taking, an SSRI. I mean, again, nothing wrong with those
Mhm.
drugs. If they're working
Mhm.
for you, great,
Mhm. Right, right. So really, remember, right, and integrate. And when we start, I'm a psychedelic assisted therapy provider, and I really try to prep the men that I work with to go ahead and do the right thing, and obviously be present and then integrate. But your point is that you take this with you. You're a year later, and you're still learning from it. Let me ask you, as we close out here our conversation, what advice would you give to someone who's considering trying psychedelics, but maybe they're, hesitant about the possible risk or some of the unknowns? And, with that, maybe, how people might get a hold of you or get a hold of your book to go ahead and help them, on their path.
Sure. Yeah. I think one of the things I really wanted to do with my book was incorporate stories of people and their actual journeys, or how it's helping them.
Mhm.
So I did that with not only my own journey, like the first chapter of the book is entirely about my journey and the insights that came up. And
Mhm.
I'm also someone who was hesitant to try it. I was nervous about it because there are a lot of unknowns, and you
Mhm.
hear all these weird stories, or you see all these weird things on TV, and you're like, oh, I'm going to lose my mind forever and I'll never be the same person. That's just not the case. So I think my book helps people to ease into something if they want more information. Again, I incorporate stories from other women as well and their journeys. So that can help. And just learning about what happens in the brain, the neurobiology. So chapter 3 is beneficial for that. So I'm hoping I can help put people at ease by providing as much information as possible and explaining all the mechanisms that occur in the body to the best that I could.
Mhm.
People can find me at
Yes.
jenniferchesak.com. The last name is spelled Chesak, or you can find me on social media. My handle everywhere is at Jen Chesak, JenChesak. And the book is available anywhere books are sold. If you walk into your independent bookstore and they don't happen to have it, you can ask them to order it.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Well, I really want to thank you for being here, and for, I'm looking forward to your talk at Wonderland, and I'm looking forward to meeting you as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to meeting you as well. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for being with us today. Your work in the industry is illuminating and timely, and we look forward to following more on our upcoming projects, your upcoming projects. To our listeners, thank you for tuning into the Mindfulness Experience podcast. Stay mindful, stay curious, and we'll see you on the next episode.